If John 1 through 5 is the prologue to the Gospel of John, then John 21, 1 through 25 could be considered the epilogue. An epilogue usually refers to the concept that the main story is completed, and we are given some future insight into some of the characters. Well, the resurrection has already been established. The main story is completed. And that resurrection proves everything that Jesus taught and everything that he prophesied concerning himself, and verifies that everything that he said is true. All of the evidence we need is provided in chapter 20 of John, which we have just completed studying. And all of the previous signs of Jesus were recorded. All of that is verified in the resurrection. What more is needed? But as John closes out the gospel, he gives us a few additional insights that we want to notice from the book. So let's begin John chapter 21 and begin reading with verses 1 through 3. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and in this way he showed himself, Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. And they said to him, we are going with you. And they went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Now this is the only record we have of this particular meeting, and we have just read that account. The Sea of Tiberias is another name for the Sea of Galilee, which is also known as the Lake of Gennesaret in Luke chapter 5, concerning something we have to say about that in a few moments. Only 7 disciples together decided to go fishing. Some had that as an occupation, others did not, so it may not have appealed to all of them to go. But we have Peter and Thomas, Nathanael, James and John. They're not named, but they are the sons of Zebedee, so we know who they are. And then there are 2 others that are not named, but presumably they were among the 12. Simon decided to go fishing, and these 6 joined him. Some have thought, with Peter saying, I'm going fishing, that he was discouraged about all that had happened and was thinking about returning to his former occupation. No, I don't see it that way at all, neither do the majority of scholars. He had already seen Jesus twice, and he had already heard the Great Commission, the one-verse summary in John 20, but also the one in Mark 16, 15, and 16. Probably he is going fishing because they're waiting. Jesus had told them to go into Galilee, and so they're waiting for his appearance. And while they're waiting, why not do some physical work and give the mind a rest from some of the weighty matters that are on their minds, some of the events that had recently transpired. They may as well do something while they're waiting. So let's see what happens. Beginning with verse 4 now. When the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, and the disciples did not know it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, Children, have you any food? And they answered, No. And he said to them, Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of the fish. Now remember, they had fished all night and couldn't find anything. Now they have a multitude of fish. Therefore, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." Well, this is an interesting turn of events. It is probably not that Jesus is keeping his identity from them, so much as it is the fact that it is daybreak and the light is not yet normal, and they are a little bit of a ways away, so they just simply do not realize that it is Jesus who is talking to them for a moment. But then a very interesting thing occurs when Jesus says to cast the net on the right side. This takes them back, or especially it takes John back, to Luke chapter 5. So let's take a look at that, beginning with the very first verse. Now so it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret. This is still another name for the Sea of Galilee. And he saw two boats standing on the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to pull out a little bit from the land, and he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. Now, when he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered and said to him, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. John is the first one who makes this connection to this event in Luke chapter 5. They caught a great number of fish, their net was breaking, so they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. When Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Well, that was the original event, and this one calls to mind that event, in that Jesus says, "Do you have any food?" And they said no. They'd been fishing all night, didn't have them. He told them where to find it. So John knew from the deja vu aspect of this who it was, without perhaps being able to identify him by sight, but nevertheless by what had been done, he knew it was the Lord. Well, let's continue with the rest of chapter 21, verse 7, through verse 14. Now when Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. Then, as soon as they had come to the land, they saw a fire of coals there, and the fish laid on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have just caught." Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Jesus then said to them, "Come and eat breakfast." Yet none of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" knowing it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. And this is now the third time that Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now, we're going to pause there and make a few observations about the things that we have just read. The New King James is unusually deficient. It is an excellent translation, but like all translations, you may find a flaw here or there. It's relatively a minor one, but nevertheless, the New King James has, for he had removed his garment. He had removed it. The verse literally translates, for he was naked. That's the literal translation. Now, he had removed his outer garment, but he is naked. The Greek word translated naked is gumnos, from which we get the word gym. And those who practiced athletics in the first century either wore nothing or very little so as to not hinder them in what they were doing. Peter was not literally naked, but when only wearing undergarments or something brief, such as swimwear, God refers to it as being naked. And so we might keep that in mind from what we have seen here. Then, when Peter put on his outer garment, he plunged into the sea. The fishing was through. It was time to go meet the Lord. They were 200 cubits out, about 300 feet, or the length of a football field. Now, Jesus had already put some fish on the fire and invited them to add some of theirs to it. He also had bread. Does this remind you of another time, another occasion, where Jesus multiplied loaves and fish? Nevertheless, here is fish that they have miraculously caught, and Jesus has bread, and so they eat. They caught 153 fish. I'm not sure that that's significant of anything except that it's a large number. And so they ate their breakfast. This was the third appearance to them as a group. He made individual appearances, but this is the third time he had met with them as a group after his resurrection. He had appeared to 10 of his disciples on the day of his resurrection, and then a week later, Thomas joined the 10, and he appeared to them at that time. And of course, this has already been recorded in chapter 20, and we've already discussed that. But this is now the third appearance that he has made to all the disciples. Now, next we want to consider verses 15 through 17. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" And he said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" And Peter answered and was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Now we want to look at this just a little bit. You know, it's interesting that there is not one word of Jesus after the resurrection criticizing Peter for having denied him 3 times. Remember that after that third time, according to Luke, Jesus turned and looked at Peter, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. Jesus knew that Peter had repented. He here gave him the opportunity to affirm his love. And since he denied him 3 times, the Lord poses this question about loving him 3 times. Elements of similarity are in both occasions. Both occurred at dawn. Remember that the rooster crowed after Peter had denied Jesus the third time. Here it is daybreak. There was a fire involved where Peter was standing around and warming himself when he denied Jesus. Here there is a fire preparing food for them to eat. And what about the number 3? Does not this indicate certainty? He certainly denied Jesus 3 times emphatically. Now he asserts his love for Jesus 3 times emphatically. But we might ask the question, to what does these refer? The loaves and the fish, emblematic of earthly things. Do you love me more than these? More than fishing? More than that work? More than food? That's one way these could be interpreted. And it may be the correct way. We don't always have an answer to every question we ask. So, yes, it might refer to the fish and be emblematic of all the things that God provides for us of a physical nature. Or does it refer to the other disciples? Do you love me more than these other disciples? Now some object, well, Peter could not know their hearts, so how could he answer that yes? Well, no, he can't know their thoughts, but he may have thought he did. Remember what he said prior to the crucifixion? Even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. Matthew 26:33. Is he not placing himself above all the others at that particular point? And even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. Matthew 26 and verse 35. So these are some things he had spoken, and certainly he must have had a good and high opinion of himself. But now let's look at something else concerning this passage. Peter, always confident of his love and faithfulness toward Christ, but now Jesus kind of shakes him up a little. The first time, Jesus asks him, do you agapos me? That's, do you love me? And that's the highest form of love. That's where, whether you like somebody or not, you do what is best for them. Whether you like what it takes to accomplish it, you still do the best for them. That's the highest love. Peter answers by saying, I love you, but he chooses the word that means affectionate, philo. I love you. The second time Jesus asks the question, he says it again. Do you love me, agape? And again, Peter answers, philo. The third time, Jesus says, do you philase me? And Peter is really disturbed at that and says, you know all things, you know I love you. So Jesus asked with one word the first 2 times. Peter answers all 3 times with a different word. Peter will not forget this conversation. Anytime he is tempted to not stand up for Jesus, he's going to remember what Jesus asked him about his love for him. But he also gives the apostle 3 charges, as we read. The first time, there are 2 nouns that are involved, and one is a verb and one is a noun. The first time, it is, do you feed my sheep, rather. And arvia is the word for sheep, and bosque is the word for feed. The second time he says, tend my lambs. Poimine is the word for shepherd or pastor. And then the third time, Jesus uses a combination of bosque and probata once again. But the idea is what? You are in a position of leadership. Jesus has not taken that away from him because he denied him 3 times. He is still going to be a leader. He is still going to teach. He will also, in addition to being an apostle and a leader, he will also be an elder or bishop or shepherd. And so it's perfectly appropriate in his case especially to say, to feed my lambs, tend to my sheep, feed my flock. These are the charges that Jesus gives him. Do you love me? Then do these things. Take care of the church. Do what you can to aid and benefit and see that the church is taught the truth. Now, Peter would not be the only one doing that. All of the apostles would be doing that. But here it is specifically mentioned to Peter, and it shows again that Jesus holds no animosity toward him for what he had done previously in denying him. Now there's just a couple of more things left in the chapter. Let's read verses 18 through 23. Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger you girded yourself and walked wherever you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. Now, according to tradition, and as we pointed out in class this morning, tradition is not in the Bible. These traditions grew up among Christians in the first few centuries. We do not know, they could be true, or they might not be true. If it's not in the Bible, we don't know. If it is in the Bible, we know what the truth is. But this is not in there, so this is just man-made tradition. According to that tradition, Peter was crucified upside down, since he did not judge himself to be worthy of being crucified the same way Christ was. And this occurred allegedly, traditionally, in Rome. However, whether that is true or not is irrelevant to the point. The point that we want to get at here is that Jesus gives Peter one last charge. Follow me. Is that not what he asks of all of us? Is that not what he commands all of us to do? Now, it was during the reign of Nero that Peter was put to death. Also, Paul. According to tradition, Peter was crucified, Paul was beheaded. According to the historian Lanctantius, Nero himself suddenly disappeared. And even the burial place of that noxious wild beast was nowhere to be seen. Nero had no respect from anybody. He put the blame of the burning of a part of Rome onto Christians. But not everybody believed him, and he just suddenly disappeared. God knows what happened to him, but the rest of us do not. Now, there is a section here where Peter asks about John. In verse 21, what about this man? Referring to the author, the disciple whom Jesus loved, to John. Jesus said to him, if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Then this saying went out among the brethren that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say that he would not die, but if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? Jesus was misunderstood as this got reported, apparently. You know how sometimes rumors get started? Well, this is one of those. There's an element of truth in it, but that element got stretched way out of shape. Jesus just said, if I will that he remain. Not that he will live till I return, but some people misconstrued that. John would be pretty old today, a little over 2,000 years old. And I'm not looking for him anywhere. And you probably won't either, because that's not what Jesus said. He just was pointing out, you don't need to worry about whether somebody else will do something different or better or greater than you. You don't need to know about what my servants are doing. You follow me. Boy, what a great lesson that is for some today. You know, some just can't do anything unless they get a lot of credit. And they're worried that somebody else might outperform them. That was what it was in the disciples. I'm not saying that condition exists here, but that condition does exist amongst even disciples, even among men who are supposed to be spiritually minded. And so there may be jealousy that exists. Is he going to do more than me? I can't have that. There's a situation in Philippians where that existed with some who were preaching the gospel, but they were preaching to get converts so that they could say they had more than Paul. Paul said their motive is wrong, but I rejoice. This is in Philippians 1:15 through 18. But I rejoice in that the gospel is being preached, even though their motives are wrong. But here again, we know that the disciples had an argument just the night before Jesus was crucified as to which one of them was going to be greater. Maybe that's still in Peter's mind as he asked the question about what's going to happen to him. Jesus says, what difference does it make what happens to him? You follow me. And that's a good philosophy for all Christians to have. I need to do my best. If somebody else is doing better, fine. Maybe they have more ability. Maybe they have more talent. So what? I follow Jesus. And that's what we need to be concerned about and what we need to think about. Now, the last two verses. This is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books which would be written. Now, that's a little bit of hyperbole, undoubtedly, but the fact is that very few of Jesus' deeds are actually told, are actually recorded. Sometimes we just have a summary. Imagine if somebody took all of the cases where Jesus had healed somebody just in one city and had written down the facts of it, the background of the person, who their parents were, what occupation they had had, how long they had had the disease, and what their life was like after they were healed. Can you imagine just telling in one city all of those stories, how big the book would be? Jesus did so much more than is recorded. But, of course, as we already noted last week, these are written that you might believe, and that believing you might have life through his name. Now, there are some things that we want to note just as we close, some insights into this chapter and this passage. Observation number one, not a single manuscript omits John 21. You know there are sometimes variations in manuscripts. But this chapter's in every single one of them, not omitted. Observation number 2. Jesus was not just an apparition. His resurrection was bodily. He could and did eat with his disciples. You know, Jehovah's Witnesses say, oh, the body just disintegrated and Jesus ascended. No, his body didn't disintegrate. It was resurrected. His actual body, he showed the nail prints to Thomas. He showed where the spear had been in his side. He ate with them. His body was physically restored to him. It's amazing how many false doctrines teach otherwise. But that's observation number 2. And then observation number 3, Jesus never appeared to his enemies. He made all of these appearances, but they were to his disciples, his friends, his supporters. Jesus never appeared to his enemies. Could the reason be because of what Abraham told the rich man in Luke chapter 16 and verse 31? But he said to them, because remember the rich man said, oh, if one were to rise from the dead, if you'd let Lazarus come back to life and go to talk to my brothers, they'd listen to him. But Abraham told him, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead, but he did not appear to his enemies because they would not have believed him either. So the appearances were to those who did believe. Now, the question to present ourselves this morning is, do you believe the facts as presented by John and others in the New Testament? Do you love him more than all that is in the world? You love him more than those things? Will you obey his command, you follow me? That's what he left for Peter to think about. And we'll conclude this morning with that same thought. Will you obey his command? Follow me. This morning, if you have not made that decision, we invite you to come and follow him. Take up his cross and follow him. Go where he leads. It begins by repenting of your sins and being baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of those sins. If you've already made that decision, have you quit following him or have you gotten sidetracked? Come back again and keep the commandment. You follow me. If we can help you in any spiritual decision along those lines, let us know while we stand.